I should introduce myself. I'm Sheila Siemens. I'm the director of the Noyo Center, and we appreciate you joining us tonight. It's nice to have so many people show up. It's nice to see so many people when it feels like we're all so tired of Zoom. So Andrew, you're a good draw. We appreciate that. For those of you who don't know Andrew, our paths crossed years ago when he was one of the leads to get a blue whale skeleton on display at UBC at the, is it Beatty or Beatty Museum?
It's Beatty.
Beatty Museum. We always say it wrong. At the Beatty Museum, and we had this whale wash in 73-foot blue whale, and we're like, what do we do with it? I did a little Google searching and I heard about this one at UBC. I called up the two folks that were the articulators that we all know so well now, Mike and Michi. And they were coincidentally on the drive to the museum to install the skeleton that they had just finished when they got our call. And they said they were just commenting to each other that they had learned so much doing the skeleton for UBC that what would they ever do with that? How could they ever put that to use? And then we call them on the drive over to help us with ours. So we hope to use both the incredible, for anyone who hasn't seen it, I highly, highly recommend you take a trip to Vancouver, go to the Beatty Museum. It is the best articulation I've seen, and certainly a real amazing model for us and what we could potentially do with our skeleton. We've already asked Andrew for advice many times over the years and will continue to do so. It was an incredible project that they did, and we look forward to getting to do that with us, with our skeleton as well. Andrew Trites, our speaker tonight, comes from the University of British Columbia. He is running the Marine Mammal Research Unit there, has been doing so for quite some time. Was introduced to us by Mark Riedrich here also with us because of their connection through the beer, the Steller IPA, and through some of the work that they were doing. And he's been a wonderful ally for us for years. Andrew was telling me they've been going through some hard times because of their connection with the aquarium there where their lab is. And so I'm happy to hear that they're getting through those hard times and looking forward to see the research that they continue to do, not only for conservation of marine mammals, but also to shed light on our human interactions with these marine mammals as well. So with that, Andrew, I will hand it to you. Before I do that though, everybody, could you please mute yourself? We will mute you if we have to, but we hope you can mute yourself. What I will ask you to do is if you have a question, can you put it in the chat, please? And Tanya says, I just noticed that she doesn't have a microphone. So Tanya, just give me your questions in the chat and I will be your voice. I will break in and interrupt Andrew if it's an appropriate time, and otherwise we'll catch your questions at the end, and then we can open it up and everyone can ask his questions directly. So mute yourself for us so we don't hear your dogs, and I'll do the same so my dogs won't bother us, and we'll hand it over to Andrew.
Okay, thank you, Sheila. I'm going to just start up my slides.
Excellent.
I should bring up the first one. I had hoped to be able to come in person to give a talk. Before I got this invitation, it was on my list, and one of our plans here at UBC was to come back to Fort Bragg. I've only been there once, and I know there's been a lot of changes since, and I thought it'd be great to come and give a talk because there's a number of things that connect Fort Bragg to Vancouver. One of them, of course, is that you're part of the California current system, and so are we. So the gray whales that swim past your door swim by ours too. California sea lions come from your neck of the woods all the way up into BC, and we share sea lions. The other thing, of course, we have in common is beer and Steller IPA. And I've been very appreciative of the support that Mark and his team have given us to support research. It's meant a lot to us, and particularly to sea lions as well. And I'll touch a little bit on that as I go. My focus today is on Steller sea lions. And I think many of you may have noticed increases in numbers of of sea lions in your neck of the woods, whether it be California sea lions or Steller sea lions. We see that here to the point that some people think we need to start culling them and removing them because they're out of control. If you live up in Alaska, particularly the Gulf of Alaska and Aleutian Islands, you would be seeing the exact opposite. In fact, the news there has been dominated by the disappearance of sea lions. They're listed as an endangered species, and that's had huge implications for fisheries management. So I've been working on this problem of trying to figure out how is it that sea lions in most of Alaska are endangered, whereas from Southeast Alaska down to California, we think they're out of control and they're increasing. So how did I get into this in the first place? I've been studying marine mammals. In fact, this is one of our research boats, the Steller Quest. And for summers after summer, we've been out surveying sea lions and counting and looking at their diets and numbers and movements. But the way I got into this was I grew up on Canada's ocean playground. And if any of you are familiar with what part of Canada that would be, it's only one that calls itself that, and that's Nova Scotia. And I grew up on the eastern side of Canada, the Atlantic Ocean. And as it turns out, my dad was a physical oceanographer. He studied ocean currents, water temperatures. And I remember my childhood, most of them were spent with him and our family camping in remote parts of Cape Breton or Newfoundland as he did his fieldwork in the summers. But I had a real passion for mathematics, and that probably came from my dad, who was just very quantitative. And I went to university initially to study math and thinking this was the future. But it didn't take long before I discovered the downside of math, which was lectures looked not so dissimilar to this. And feeling the end that math by itself was not all that fascinating. And instead, I saw a way in which I could combine my ability to do math with my passion for animals. And I'd grown up with, yes, I'm a cat person, but loved all animals in general and just fascinated by it and saw ways in which we could apply math to solve biological problems. The other thing that I had a real passion for was mystery books. And I'm only certain that a few of you online know what this series is, the Hardy Boy books, but I just love them. And there's something intuitively wonderful about being able to figure things out and the satisfaction that comes with solving problems. And you may remember some of these titles: The House on the Cliff, Secret of the Caves, The Missing Chums. And in my case, I managed to now have a career going back almost 40 years, looking at different mysteries, whether it's the decline of southern resident killer whales, a new species of fur seals, the Cape Flattery fur seal, or in this case here, this mystery of the missing Steller sea lions. What I'm talking about here is like in any good murder mystery, up in the, from Prince William Sound, all the way in fact across to Russia, Steller sea lions are missing. And that was all that was known for sure in the 1990s. It started, in fact, in the 1980s. It was just noticed that there were fewer and fewer, but there were no bodies. Nobody found any dead animals. All they noticed is that each year they go out, there seemed to be fewer. Well, like any good murder mystery, we have a person of interest. And who would the number one suspect be? Well, it was the commercial fishermen. And the feeling here was that sea lions had declined at about the same time that the world's biggest fishery was building, and that was for walleye pollock. And walleye pollock is turned into surimi, artificial crab, it's into fish burgers, it's into all sorts of different products. When we look at the diets of sea lions, we see that for Steller sea lions, they eat most of the same things that people also like to eat. So that it's herring, sandlance, capelin, smelts, salmon, flatfish, cod, pollock, rockfish, Atkin mackerel, octopus, squid, and sculpins, which may not be high on many people's diets, but certainly I've met some Aleuts, some of the indigenous people in Alaska who tell me that sculpin soup is one of the most delicious soups you can make. For Stellers, I think one of the things, we've got 5 species of sea lions in the world, 2 here in the Northern Hemisphere, the California sea lion, which you're very familiar with, and the Steller, which is the largest of all 5 species. And so here we've got females at about 300 kilos. They give birth to pups about 20 kilos, and bulls are about 700 to 1,000 kilos. Now I realize that not everybody outside of science uses kilograms. So in pounds, to make it a bit easier, it's about 650 pounds for a female. Compare that to your own weight, you can see they're really hefty. Pups then at birth about 45 pounds, and bulls then somewhere between about 1,500 to 2,200 pounds. And I think what stands out to me is just how much larger these males are compared to the females, 2 to 3 times larger. And I know often if I speak with kids, I say, can you imagine if your dad was like 3 times bigger than your mom, to give you some sense of the difference in size. One thing to point out is I often see this, are they stellar or stellar? And hopefully, if you take one thing away from my lecture tonight, you recognize that these are Steller sea lions, named for George Steller, an explorer naturalist. And these are Steller sea lions. So hopefully it stands out. They're definitely Stellers, ER. Let me just give you a little taste here of what they sound like and look like. You can hear the roars of wind. This would be one of the hollowed sites of British Columbia. Lots of spots they can go, but they tend to like to climb on top of each other. See some big bulls in here, some adult females, some juveniles, but no pups at this site. Pups are born at rookeries, breeding areas. And here you can see one hole in the water, 2 adult females at the rocks, and pups here. And inevitably, when you have 2 pups that are fighting, you can be sure what their sex is. They are males. Start developing this at a very young age. You learn to battle. At the end of the day, the breeding big males will come ashore to protect territories and breed with the females that are there. Their distributions is shown roughly here. So from California, the far right, all the way up across the Aleutian Islands, over to, let me go all the way over here to Kamchatka. And the interesting thing with the numbers is that if we look at patterns, we see 2 distinct patterns here. Animals to the right belong to one genetic stock. They're genetically distinct, have been separated for hundreds of thousands of years, and have been called the Eastern stock and the Western stock. To our eyes, they look identical, but genetically, they are very, very different. Now, the interesting thing is not only are they genetically different, but their dynamics are completely different. We've got counts that started in the 1950s, but we see that in around 1971, 72, we see a big change here in their patterns. We see everything to this side of the line declined all the way through into Russia, while everything here in the Eastern stock increased. There's also now genetically recognized a 3rd population be called the Russian stock, and they're genetically distinct, and the line is somewhere over here in the far east. A bit more detail, and I can give you access here to some more detailed maps, but we're seeing here a different projection, but the only place they exist is in the North Pacific. So from California up into Canada, Southeast Alaska, across the Aleutians here into the Sea of Okhotsk. And here we've got rookeries. These are the only breeding sites. We are seeing new sites being established here in Southeast Alaska, British Columbia, Oregon, and Washington. And so they are expanding, but they're not expanding out here. In terms of resting sites, that's shown here at the bottom, you can see that there are far, far, far more sites where Steller sea lions can be found. Some of these sites are only used in the wintertime, and some of them are used year round. The way we know how many sea lions are is by counting them. And typically in Canada, the way they've been counted has been with small planes, And then as we come over top of a hollowed or rookery site, the pilot turns the plane on its side and you get photographs like this, and then we'll count them. In the olden days, we would count them by shining a slide on a piece of white paper and marking the paper. Now it's all done with computers. And also increasingly now, photos are being taken using high format, high resolution cameras mounted to the bottom of airplanes. So everything is timed precisely with much better pictures. So counting on land gives us a census count, but then you need to know in terms of the total population, you have to come up with correction factors to know how many were at sea. And that's been done both using behavioral observations as well as putting tracking tags onto animals. So we know at any given time what proportion is missing, so we can add it back into the population. So I'm going to show you here what I've done to reconstruct numbers of sea lions from the census counts. The earliest counts we have for the Western population is in 1956. And I've got data that goes up to 2018. And you'll see here on the y-axis, we've got numbers of sea lions up to about 300,000. So this Western population that goes from Prince William Sound across the Aleutian Islands, it starts off at about 250,000 animals. And the population was growing initially as it was being followed from year to year. It peaked around 1970, 71, and then it began to drop. And it was falling faster and faster to the point that people became concerned and might even go extinct. It hit an inflection point in 1989, another one in 1999, and now has been slowly rounding the bend and holding its own. And so while most of that Western population senses it's now recovering, we still have the Western Aleutian Islands where the population is still dropping. So they're not out of the woods by any means. So how does that compare with sea lions where you live and I live? And so that we call the Eastern population. And here we'll see their numbers are much lower. And so we start in here at just under 50,000. And they were declining at the beginning, hit bottom. And since they were protected with the Marine Mammal Protection Act, they've been increasing. There are now more sea lions in this Eastern population than in the Western one. Now, when you look at this graph, you may not think that it looks too dramatic in the sense of, I don't know, it's increasing, but it doesn't look to be that big an increase. And particularly if you listen to some of the news reports or speak with some fishermen, perhaps, as they talk about this explosion of sea lions. Well, I want to show you what this same data set looks like if I plot it on a different scale. So here, then, we're comparing the two populations, Eastern and Western. Let me just plot the Eastern by itself. So I'm going to plot the same data. In this case here, we've got the line that's going from 0 to 90,000 animals. And we'll see here, here's what the same data looks like. So we see here with the earliest counts, we see this drop. And then we've got protection occurring with the Fisheries Act in Canada, the Marine Mammal Protection Act in the United States. And we're seeing this rise here. So sea lions are not showing any sign yet of hitting carrying capacity, although they will, of course, ultimately hit that. And it may well be due to transient killer whales that are their biggest predator, and they may end up controlling their numbers just as they appear to be controlling harbor seal numbers along the coast. For a lot of people, they think of sea lions and other marine mammals as being canaries in the coal mine, and that we can use them to figure out what's going on in the ocean. And so if we see a decline of sea lions up in Alaska, does that mean that the ecosystem has collapsed? If we see sea lions increasing in California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, does that mean the ecosystem is out of balance? It does tell us something. And then the challenge we have as biologists is to figure out, what does it mean? What is it telling us? Is it telling us that things are okay, things are different, or that there are problems? So what I worked on for, and still working on, in fact, is to resolve why is it that sea lions have declined so rapidly in Alaska while they've been increasing very sharply in British Columbia and further south. And so here, shown as a puzzle, are all different reasons on here. And so we've had everything from changes in food, predators, immigration. Some people thought sea lions just left Alaska, went somewhere else. Maybe there's a disease problem, parasites. Could it be killer whales? Could it be sharks? Was commercial whaling involved? Is there pollution problems? You've got a theory and we could put it on here. And that's where we started out. And so there have now been millions of dollars spent trying to figure this out. So I'm going to give you the 4 clues that we had in 1990 to get started with sorting out what was going on. And the first clue came with body size measurements of sea lions. And there was a sample of sea lions shot, several hundred animals in the 1970s. And keep in mind that at that time, it was the way that a lot of biology was done. It was done, you would shoot your study animal, and then you would learn everything from pregnancy rates by looking at reproductive tracts. You would look at stomach contents to do diet. You would pull teeth to age them, to know survival rates and the age structure of the population, and would take body size measurements as well to know sizes at age. And there was a second sample taken in the 1980s, and in similar ways, and they were compared. And the conclusion that was drawn is that the animals in the 1980s were physically smaller for a given age than they were in the 1970s. That's clue 1. The second clue came from looking at reproductive tracts of these same samples. And what they found is that there were 30 to 40% reproductive failures. And so if they started with animals, I don't know, sampled in the late fall, going into the new year, they found that over time, fewer of the females were pregnant. And so we're seeing signs of reproductive failures. And the other thing that they reported was that the pregnancy rates had declined among the lactating females during the 1980s. And so what that means is that Steller sea lions will give birth to a pup. They're going to nurse it well into the fall and into the new year. But what they found is that these females that were producing milk, that were lactating, their pregnancy rates were lower. And so they seem to be having trouble maintaining their pregnancies. That was clue 2. Clue 3 comes from the same data set. And what they found was that the juveniles, so between the stage of being a pup and about 2 to 3 years of age, there were fewer of them in that second sample from the 1980s. And they concluded that there was a very high mortality rate. And so something they believed was killing these young animals, probably after the time of weaning. That's clue 3. Here's clue 4, and it's diet information. And so here in this table is showing you diets in 3 categories of fish over 4 time periods. I'm just going to start with the first line. So at this time, it was the most recent data we had. And since then, it's been fairly similar during the 2000s as well. But here you'll see that the gadids, these are fish like codfish and walleye pollock, made up about 85% of the diet, or 85% of the stomachs contained these species. Flatfish, about 13% of the stomachs did. And the pelagics were things like herring and sandlance, the small schooling oily fishes. Sardines would also fit into that category, but of course we don't have sardines that far north. Now, if you're pretty quick with math, you'll see these don't add up to be 100%. And that's because one stomach could have more than one species. So this is essentially the probability of opening up a stomach and finding any one of these species groups. When we go then back into time, this is what was so fascinating. Look here at the gadids. As we go back in time, you'll see that it starts at 85%. In the 80s, it was at 60%, then 32%. And back in the 50s and 60s, when sea lions were at their all-time high, there were very few gadids found in any of the stomachs they looked at. We see a similar pattern with flatfish. It looks as though they've never been a preferred prey, but you'll see here that their numbers also decline here going back into time. But then when we look at the oily, small, silvery schooling fishes, it's the exact opposite. So relatively rare in the 90s and going back into the 50s and 60s, the stomachs contained almost uniquely those species. So those are our 4 clues. And now we come to all the different theories. of what it could be. And it's hard to see a link here with toxins or storms. It doesn't seem to fit with these data sets. But what does seem to fit is right here, some sort of change in food that could affect survival rates, pregnancy rates, body sizes. So change in food, but then like, what's the mechanism? Well, one, and the most obvious one when I started was it must be overfishing that's caused a change in food. But then as I began looking at this for longer and longer, I began to realize that it may be not something caused by people, but something related to a natural change. So it's a bit like climate change, except this one here is very natural. It's referred to as regime shifts. And these are natural shifts in the ocean environment, a little bit like an El Nino event, except something on a much longer time scale. And then there also was reports on here about killer whales and sharks. And so we ended up then focusing, most of the research is then focused on some change in food, either caused by fishing or regime shifts, or an effect of predation. So let's explore a little bit this question here about change in food, or what's kind of referred to as being nutritional stress. The big species that are being caught in the highest numbers are also the highest species in their diets. It's walleye pollock, Pacific cod, and Atka mackerel. And an Atka mackerel is related to lingcod. It's a hexagrammate, also related to kelp greenlings. So it's not a true mackerel in the way you might think of them, but these are ground fish, for the most part, bottom fish or species that live. They're also white-fleshed fish as well. So there certainly is a correlation, or at least there would appear to be, in terms of what people are catching in high numbers and what sea lions have been eating during this time that their population has been declining. Thing with this is, and in fact, the very first analysis I did was to get all the fishing data I could find and look for correlations in time and place. And I couldn't find any relationships whatsoever between amounts caught. And a number of other people have tried similar things, and the numbers just didn't add up. When we speak to the fisheries experts, there's no indication of global fish stock reductions. In fact, the pollock experts tell us that as the fishing was building up, that the size of the pollock stock was getting bigger, not smaller, as fishing was getting underway. And these fisheries are also certified by the Marine Stewardship Council as being sustainable. So something here just isn't quite adding up. That yes, there must be a food problem, but we can't find a sign of the fish having disappeared or being in lower abundances where these declines have occurred. Nor when we ask this question about malnourished, we know what happens during El Nino events, and I'm sure many of you have seen that firsthand in California, starving young animals in particular. Either mums can no longer produce milk, or weaned animals can't find any fish. They're just too deep and inaccessible to them. And in this case here, with the sea lions, we never saw any sign here of any kind of starving animals. And we know what to look for. You look for signs of hips showing through, ribs, but we never saw any sign in the declining area of anybody looking malnourished. In fact, everybody looked pretty much fat and healthy. So certainly no signs of acute nutritional stress, no starvation. The other interesting thing was talking to fishermen. And I'd spent a number of times going up to Alaska, going to some of the fishing trade shows to meet fishermen and talking about the research we were doing. And one of the common stories I heard, and was later backed up by researchers showing with images here, was that how the fisheries had changed. And they talked about how in the 1960s, shrimp fishing was big. And then in the 70s, they began to see codfish coming in and getting into their catches. And that by the 1980s, the shrimp were largely gone, the small pelagic fish were gone, and it was a fishery being dominated by flatfish, cod, pollock, and Atka mackerel. So they saw some big changes that have occurred over the same time period. So if we can't find any evidence here of overfishing, despite so much effort and thinking it must be so obvious. What about the other possibility that there is an overabundance of these fish that they're eating? Could that explain it? And this seems kind of counterintuitive to think that you could have an overabundance of a fish and that could pose a problem. It's been called the junk food hypothesis. And what this hypothesis states is basically that there's too many low energy prey in the ecosystem, cod and pollock, so white fleshed fish that tend to not have very much fat on them, and not enough of the fatty fish, things like sand lance and herring, the oily fish that would have a lot more calories in it. And certainly this is consistent with the diet data that I showed you that shows them eating more of these low energy fish than the fatty ones that were there when the population was higher. So, but does that make sense? And is it possible that the sea lions could be essentially being malnourished by living in a sea here of celery? And the best way I can equate it is to, because we often think of marine mammals as being gluttons, that they can just eat as much as they want. They're bottomless pits. But if I was to put you into a field of celery and say, just eat as much as you want, it's all there for you, I guarantee you're all going to come back to me and say you're full, but you're still hungry. And that's because you're not getting enough calories in before you become full. So that was something that we proposed here for Steller sea lions as a possible explanation. And then to go further with this, it then became a question of undertaking field studies, captive studies. We brought sea lions in from the wild and raised them and trained them to take part in studies trying to replicate the changes that occurred in Alaska. We built simulation models, energetic models, and did various sorts of laboratory analysis as well. And so just to give you a very quick sense, then in terms of field studies, we began to compare sea lions in British Columbia and Southeast Alaska, where the population was growing and they were thought to not have any kind of a food problem. And we compared them to the Gulf of Alaska and Aleutian Islands. There's also a lot of effort put into reciting known individuals to learn about movements. Many animals were branded, and it was a way to learn about reproductive rates and pregnancy rates and survival rates. Also put a lot of effort into collecting scats, feces, and we would send people ashore to scrape them off the rocks. And then we've learned to develop techniques using both DNA and hard part analysis to be able to determine the species. And in my case, we sent out a number of teams of people to different islands where they would camp out. One site we had it occupied for a full year, and others were more seasonal, to keep track of individual animals and try to understand their behaviors from observing them. Other team members looked at capturing animals, and these were some of the earliest devices that were developed. They were glued to the fur of the animal. And we also developed here, in addition to knowing where the animals were going and swimming, we wanted to know when the animals captured their first fish. And so here we developed a stomach temperature pill. And the idea of this is you would put it into the stomach of a sea lion. And if the sea lion swallowed a fish, it would be like you or I eating a bowl of ice cream. Your stomach temperature will drop, and you can then determine when a successful prey capture happened. And in case you're wondering, how do you get a stomach pill into a sea lion? Well, it's as simple as putting your hand down the throat. In this case, of course, the sea lion is anesthetized, and then it's going to send a radio signal to that backpack unit with the stomach temperature, and then the device comes off, and we can download the data. So what do we learn from all these different studies? And I'm going to give you a very brief summary on here, showing you a declining side and increasing. And we made some predictions, assuming that there was a shortage of fish. In other words, that overfishing had occurred. We expected sea lions to go on really long feeding trips where the population was declining, and where they were increasing, and we assumed there was no overfishing occurring, they go on very short trips. In terms of the weights of pups, we assume that this population where they're declining must have very small, light pups, underweight, because there's not enough milk being produced. And here we expected to find heavy pups. So what did we find? Oh, these are just some of the different sites where we did these different studies and different islands to do the comparisons. And what we observed then from the telemetry that I showed you, that you see here that it took about 7.5 hours was the time of the average feeding trip. So the time they would go out to sea, look for fish and come back to nurse their pups, compared to 39 hours where the population was increasing. In terms of the time it took to swallow the first fish, less than an hour where they're declining. And here, it was taking them almost 5 hours to capture the first fish. From our behavioral observations, where we had a lot more animals being followed, and we could essentially with a stopwatch keep track of their comings and going, we found the same results. We found that they went on shorter feeding trips where the population was declining and longer trips where they were increasing. But what about pup weights? Did the data fit the predictions we made? And here again, we found by weighing the pups, the exact opposite. The pups where they were declining the pups were in the region of declining were heavier and much lighter where the population was increasing. So it didn't fit with what we had understood to be going on. But what it does fit with is a very high abundance of walleye pollock, in particular in these areas where we were studying them. And so if the density of whitefish is really high, then the females have no trouble capturing them. They can spend more time on shore producing milk to feed their pups and making bigger pups. So all this suggests that there was a lot of food available for the declining population, whereas the increasing one, they weren't eating very much pollock. They had to work harder for their meals, and as a result had less time to feed their pups and were producing lighter pups overall. So there is a big difference in the diets between the two regions, but you can see it doesn't fit with the overfishing hypothesis, but it is consistent with the junk food hypothesis. So one of the challenges in doing just field work is you can't control many variables. And so we brought sea lions into captivity, starting with them as pups. They were hand raised, starting with bottles. And we worked with them initially at the Vancouver Aquarium. And then we took some of the pups, or now juveniles, out to our open water research station. And that was located up at the southernmost fjord in North America. We had really deep water, and we were able then to work with some of these animals and learn more about them by running various experiments. And we're just going to show you a little video clip of some of the things that we did here. And it's going to start here. This was our site. And we would set up and pump fish down to different depths to create artificial schools of fish. Measure the energy they're expending. We need them to breathe inside a dome where you can capture oxygen and CO2. And from this, we can determine how many calories they're burning as they are searching for food.
Yasha, dive.
So it's coming down to the bottom of the feeding tube. And then at the end of the experiment, the animals would then come back up here to the surface and would surface inside the dome. So remarkably well trained, wearing a harness here. All of our animals always came home, and yet they had this freedom to leave if they'd wanted to. So it was about this time as we were starting up that one of our technicians, Brandon Russell, reached out to North Coast Brewing to point out that Red Seal Ale, in fact, there was not a seal on the label, it was really a sea lion. And by chance, Brandon, the person who took the call at North Coast, was Mark. Rudrick. And I think Mark could see perhaps a little bit of himself in Brandon, who was quite brash as he was speaking, and had this common interest in marine biology. And one thing led to another. And fortunately for us, Steller IPA was created. And it allowed us to do so much more at our open water research station, including making new discoveries there and continuing our work now at the Vancouver Aquarium. One of the unfortunate things for us with COVID is that our open water site, we can no longer support it. And the Vancouver Aquarium came close to bankruptcy and was sold this past summer. Fortunately for us, the new owners are very supportive of our research. So we've got a graduate student still working with the Stellers and also doing some research here still on diet with them. So the research is continuing, but it was one of the casualties of COVID and a big change for us in what we were doing. But research is continuing. I'm going to show you some of the results, and there's just so much we could talk about in terms of the new things we discovered about sea lions that nobody knew before. But this was one of our very first studies we did. And these were with juvenile Steller sea lions. And what we wanted to do was to switch their diets. I showed you in that one piece of evidence that the diets had changed from, I'm going to go from fatty fish like herring and sand lance to lean fish like pollock. And so in this experiment, we initially gave the sea lions herring, and we allowed them to eat as much as they wanted to. So we had trainers there, and as soon as the sea lion started to play with its food or not swallow it or drop it, they would stop feeding them. So they were getting about 5% of their body weight per day. We then switched them to walleye pollock, and we saw them eat a little bit more pollock, about 5.5% of their body weight per day. And then we put them back onto herring again after about 2 weeks. And here we can see they ate slightly more again. Well, what happened to their body weights during this time period? Well, when they were being fed herring, we found that they were gaining about 0.2 kilos. So that's about half a pound per day. When they were eating pollock, we found they were losing weight. They lost about half a pound, lost about half a kilo. So they were losing over a pound per day eating pollock, even though they could eat as much as they wanted. And when we put them back onto herring, they began to put weight back on again. So that was the first experimental evidence we had of the junk food hypothesis. We looked at other elements about pollock in terms of how many calories it costs to burn up the fish to digest it, the effective size of fish in digestion. And what we concluded from this was that for a sea lion that eats pollock, you would have to eat 35 to 80% more pollock than herring to get the same amount of energy out of the fish. Well, one of the criticisms, and in science, it's all about you put your ideas out there, you publish it, and then people point out things you should have done, or they want you to see it go further, because it was hard for people to accept the fact that these results could be true. There must be something else going on. So they said, well, maybe you got the result because you had a trainer effect. So we decided to set up a sea lion all-you-can-eat buffet study, and just by putting food out into trays. And I'd say one of our motivations here, this is Billy, one of our head trainers here with one of our sea lions. And just to show you what it looks like, should you have been in the wild to do this, this is footage from a trawler in Alaska. This was not our experiment, by the way. The size difference. Male is going to be around 2,000 pounds. The guy's probably around 200 pounds. Full difference in body weight. Feeling will go when he's ready. What I pretty like in this little piece here is to see him looking for the perfect size fish, the one for the road. Somewhere. That's not it. Goodbye. There we go. Now we can go. So our experiment wasn't quite like that one. And what we did here was put out food trays. We set it up using different types of fish as well. And we wanted to understand what was the max amount they could consume. And what we found was that their stomach allowed them to eat about 16 to 18% of their body weight. And so what we're saying is, then is that sea lions can get full. And typically with marine mammals, most marine mammal researchers don't consider the fact that just like people, animals can get full. And in this case, they might get full before they've got enough calories to eat. So to understand how much do they need, we built some energetic models using mathematics, and found that for a 6-year-old animal, so that would now be a mature animal in the case of a female, needs about 7% of its body weight per day. And so you can see that's well below the maximum amount that they could put into their stomachs. This 7%, by the way, is based on a mixed diet, so it's not dominated by pollock, but it's a mixture of different fish. But if we then go and look at a young animal, how much does it need per day? It needs about 14%. And so you can see that on a mixed diet, it's right there at the limit. But if it was on a pollock diet, it wouldn't have the stomach capacity to be able to consume enough fish to meet its daily needs. The reason why the energy needs of a young animal are so much higher is because of body growth. It's the most expensive things that animals do. So conclusion then is that these young animals appear to be energetically sort of living right on the edge. And if they are in a sea that's dominated by herring, I'm going to say sardines, sand lance, then they could wean at the end of a year and switch on to solid food, and they've got the stomach capacity to do it. But if they're living in a sea that's dominated by low energy fish, they're not going to be able to switch on to the low energy fish without starving, granted with full bellies. And so there it appears that they stay longer with their mothers for maybe 1 or 2 years if they're going to be weaned in a place that's got low energy prey. And so the system, and this again was pieced together by looking at some winter behavioral observations. This is from one of our sites in Southeast Alaska. And what we noticed is that reproductive failures, and we didn't have a whole lot to keep track of, but we found that animals were aborting fetuses between January, February, and March. And it was also noteworthy in that the bald eagles shown here would swoop in each time that they saw a fetus to consume it. And so we would cause great disturbances as well. And so the hypothesis we put forward from this is that all sea lions are getting pregnant each year. For mothers that currently have a pup, they will wean the pup, assuming that the ocean is full of fat fish where the pup will survive. But if they're in a spot where the ocean is dominated by low energy fish, the females will abort their fetus and therefore continue the relationship with their pup. And the females are not consciously deciding this. It's likely to be a function of lactation and probably eating a fish that has got less lipid in it and more protein. And so it's probably something to do with hormones and an imbalance is causing this. In terms of changes in body size, one of the things that we were curious about is trying to understand, did sea lions get smaller in the 1980s compared to the 1970s? And unfortunately, because of a couple of things that happened, but most notably from stranding programs that collect skulls and preserve them and museum collections, we were able to go back in time and measure skulls to see whether or not the skulls of animals historically had changed in size over time. And you might wonder, how many ways can you measure a skull? Well, let me show you and count the ways with you. And so this was with a researcher from Japan measuring skull sizes. And what we found here is that we expected this relationship, that when sea lions were high, the skulls would be bigger and would have gotten smaller. And instead, we found the opposite of what had been published. We found that, that the juveniles had gotten bigger in the area of decline, but there's no difference in the size of adults. And so the bigger size of juveniles is consistent with the bigger weights of pups in this region. So presumably they're getting more nutrition from their mom by staying longer. We also looked into understanding these patterns here and changes in fishes over time, and can find relationships here with ocean climate change. It's referred to as oceanic regime shifts, things like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And there's some very tight correlations that seem to explain a lot of the patterns that have been observed in terms of the fish communities that increased and the ones that declined. So reviewing here the 4 clues I showed you at the beginning, starting first here with the diet data, we see evidence that diets in fact did change, and gadids are dominating the diet. And when we compare the diets of sea lions in our eastern populations, so everywhere from Southeast Alaska south, we see energy richer fish in their diets. In terms of changes in birth rates, again, for behavioral observations, we observe the same sorts of things. And so we find support for this clue as well. However, when we look here at this question about juvenile survival, it appears that the data were misinterpreted. It isn't that the pups had died, it's that they weren't born. That's why they were missing, because females were keeping their pups longer. And at the time this analysis was done, the basic thinking was that all sea lions weaned every year, or most of them did. And we now find evidence where major portions of the newborn pups are staying with their moms longer in the region where they're declining. So no support for this. And finally here with the body size, and thankfully, because all these skulls have been collected, in fact, some of the largest collections of skulls are in California, we did not find any support for this publication. And when we looked harder and made some discussion, people have been involved, we discovered that in the 70s, they measured the pups, or they measured all the animals that had been shot belly up. And in the 80s, they measured them with them belly down. And any of you that have worked in taking measurements, you know that you can easily, the weight of a belly pushing down on a spinal column can stretch an animal. And it appears then that the difference was caused by measurement error because they didn't use the same methods to measure them in both time periods. So as we come back then to the original puzzle I showed you of all these different theories, the evidence we have is consistent here with regime shift having caused a natural change in food. The big concern now, of course, is that with climate change, that the system we're currently seeing may be the one that sea lions are permanently locked into now. So the ocean, even though regime shifts will still be occurring, they're likely to be occurring in a much warmer ocean and never get back to the colder stages that Alaska once had. There's also evidence that predators, particularly killer whales, are having impact and can impede population recovery. So conclusions then is that the ecosystem has changed due to shifts in ocean climate. It hasn't collapsed, and it's happened repeatedly in the absence of humans. And second, that this decline of sea lions is primarily due to reproductive failure and predation associated with eating low energy prey species. For those that like to read more about this, there was a book published this past year called The Ethology and Behavioral Ecology of Otolrheids and the Otobennid. And I wrote a chapter in there about Steller sea lions. So it's full of every fact and figure you want to know about the natural history of Steller sea lions. And you might find it fascinating reading, or maybe like this Steller, find it to be a real snoozer. But I'll put a link into the chat where you can download a copy of this if you'd like to read that. I want to thank you. This is our blue whale, which Sheila mentioned earlier, and this is Mike. And interestingly, Mike got into this because he took a marine mammal course that I was co-teaching, must have been back in the 80s. And his project for the class was to build his very first skeleton, which was a sea otter. And he and I have been friends, and I really value my interactions with him, his wife, his parents-in-law, and we do have an amazing skeleton. But it does show you, for some of you that may be younger in this call, there are different ways to get into this, and this is one. And I also want to do a special thank you to Mark and North Coast Brewing. and to say just how appreciative we have been to have Northwest Brewing support research, support conservation efforts. It's important for the NOIA Center, it's important for the Marine Mammal Research Unit and the Marine Mammal Center as well. So thank you for that. And if you want to follow this, we have our website here where you can get copies of our publications. I think we must have close to 200 publications on there now. And so you can read about the research. You may want to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. It's all UBC Marine Mammal. And that's my basic story. We've got a lot of research right now happening on killer whales that might be of interest to you, including some research happening in California on killer whales. Also involved with gray whales as well, quite a bit at the moment, in addition to fur seals and sea lions. So thank you, Sheila, and thank you everybody for listening. And Sheila, I think you're muted.
Thank you.
The most overused phrase in Zoom meetings.
Sorry about that. I was praising your storytelling and telling us such a good tale, but I was hoping you could help me understand a little bit what we're seeing differently with the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and these massive climate shifts and marine heat waves. Like, are those now sort of intermingling and messing the data a little bit? You said that this is like seems to be something that's sort of sticking.
Yeah, so we've got, data, a lot of it is measured at lighthouse stations and everything from water temperatures to air pressure. Mm-hmm. And over time, as the data is analyzed, you can see there's been periods when we can think of the oceans being in a warm phase, and then it switches very rapidly into a cool phase. And it lasts for like 25 to 40 years into these fixed periods. And that appears to have gone on for thousands of years.
Right.
Now we're into a period with climate change that is superimposed over top of these natural changes. So instead of going from a hot, or let's say from a warm to a cool, it's now going to be pushing the cool is now going to be warm and the warm is going to be hot. And we may be locked into so that these big changes that have occurred naturally, we're not going to see them again. So that's the real game changer. It appears that, with Steller sea lions, what's interesting is that they have this plasticity in their age at weaning. And we have to think, so why would, harbor seals, it's like clockwork when they wean their pups. Fur seals do the same, but why do Steller sea lions and California sea lions too also have this plasticity? And I think it's because they're so much larger and they've got higher energy requirements. And it's a way that the animals have naturally evolved to buffer environmental shifts. How well that's going to serve them with climate change, nobody knows yet.
So the future doesn't look great for the Western population then?
It's looking better than it did. But
that's right, because the trend was going up
yeah.
just ever so slightly.
But on the other hand, if your value is marine mammals, let's say the pinnipeds, you go, boy, it's rough up there. But if what you really love is catching pollock and cod, you think this is the best ecosystem ever. And so it comes down to different values. And I think what I've learned from this is that, the ecosystem has got all these different species. It's really complex. All the species are still there, but the relative mixtures are different. And we can't have all of it there in high abundance all the time. And so then on top of that, we've got the direct human impacts, everything from contaminants to fishing effects to climate change effects, ocean acidification. So the oceans are being challenged more now than ever before. So we've got everything from natural cycles that were there, the animals adapted to, now superimposed with this massive change here in climate. And none of us know where it's going to go other than to say, at least we've got a lot of baseline data now for the purpose of comparison.
Yeah, thank God for that. And we want to also shout out to Cal Academy. You said California has some of the best collections of sea lions. We now have Andrew, we now have a little sea lion skull wall to demonstrate exactly that and why this kind of research is so important. So that's really helpful for us as well. Okay, you have a backup of questions in the chat, which I didn't they're all coming in now, but first question is from Tanya. She says, is the prey switch to fish that are higher on the food chain? Is this?
I'm not sure I would say that they're higher on the food chain. So, one thing we've done in some of the ecosystem models we built, we can look at trophic levels. And one of the things that struck me early on is to discover that one of the species that's at the highest trophic level, right up there with the sea lions, are flatfish. And so it really depends on what they're eating. So I wouldn't say, so we have to be a little bit careful as we think about trophic levels. You've got, the transient killer whales at the very highest. Then you've got a gray whale that's way down there at the bottom. And then you've got manatees that are vegetarians of all things, really low. And so marine mammals, they span the entire gamut of trophic levels. What I would say is that if you're going to be successful as a marine bird or a marine mammal, you need fat. It's all about the fat. Now for us, and maybe that's something too, I wish in hindsight, we didn't call this the junk food hypothesis, because, junk food to us is like potato chips and deep fat fried foods. But really the definition of junk food is things that's bad for your health. And if you're a marine mammal, what's bad for your health is lean cuisine. And if you're a person, well, because we get so much processed food, it's the high fat foods. So I wish if I could turn the clock back, I would have called it the Nutri-Light hypothesis and focus on the diet industry. And it would have got a lot less flack, I think, for it as well.
I thought it was funny you called it the junk food diet, and then you have a picture of one eating a piece of celery.
Yeah.
That's not junk food in California.
Yeah.
Okay, so Bob says, you mentioned the difference in how the sea lions were measured was a factor in the supposed difference in body size. Were not the sea lions being weighed, and would not that be a more accurate way of comparing change in body size over time?
So is the question about body weight? Sorry, maybe just repeat the question so I understand.
You mentioned the difference in how the sea lions were measured as a factor in the supposed difference in body size.
Mm-hmm.
So why weren't you just measuring? It sounds like he's saying, were they just directly weighed? And if not, wouldn't that have been a more accurate way of doing it?
So, yeah, and so weight has got issues too in terms of if the stomach is full or not, if the animal's bled out or not. Typically, and also in the case of males, we have the seasonal fattening. And so the males, they fatten up for the summer breeding season, and then they go on like a crash diet because there's a metabolic cost to carry all that extra weight through the late summer into the winter. And so males would not be an accurate way to do it. It could be reasonable for the females, but body length is typically a much more solid measure of size. In the same way that, I don't know, if we're really talking about how big we are, we typically talk about our heights and therefore what the average body weight should be for a height. Although I know most of us exceed what the recommended weights are. But height is the typical measure, and length is going to be more accurate, except with marine mammals, because, like with pinnipeds, I mean, the cetaceans are different, but the pinnipeds, I know at one point, you take the body and you would put it under a measuring board, and then somebody would take the head and pull the nose up to touch the zero line. And they're just like accordions. And so we have to get really strict with people about how you measure them. You got to like plop them down and you look where the nose is, read that number out in the tail. And if it's belly up or belly down, you're going to get a difference in lengths. So, and I think now that people understand that, and it should be just all part of the protocols of all the stranding networks, so the data are comparable. But yeah, so while length is more accurate in terms of its usefulness, it can also be more biased too, without people realizing it.
Yeah, fascinating. Wow. Okay, Tanya comments that she believes similar delays in weaning were found in the Galapagos sea lions with El Nino, La Nina oscillations as well.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's been unfortunate. There's not as much of the literature on California sea lions has been published, if you compare it to Steller sea lions. And so I know some of the researchers, and I see so many parallels, but there's less, there's a lot known about it. It tends to be more in people's heads, I think, and not as much in the published literature. But I see lots of parallels between the two species.
Yeah, we've had a number of talks about nutritional stress. It certainly does seem, even if it's transient with, year to year with some of the changes in foraging.
And one thing, Sheila, I put into the chat a link to that publication, the book chapter.
Oh, yes, great.
So if any of you want to read more about this, if you're having trouble going to sleep tonight, you might want to download it now. Or if you're just looking for some more facts or just seeing some of the literature. The chapter's got, I try to cite everything I could find on Steller. So I think it's the most complete account of the species ever put together so far.
That's awesome. And then one sort of follow-up to the question about the trophic levels in the food chain was her thought. She kind of says, my thought was more about whether eating higher on the food chain affected toxic accumulation.
So that part is true, that particularly when you're eating higher trophic species, you're seeing this bioaccumulation of contaminants, and it's particularly associated with fat and being attached with lipids. So we certainly see that. In the case of females, though, they get to download their contaminant load to initially their firstborn, as it usually goes into the milk. And so those can be issues. Although in the case here for Stellers out in the Aleutian Islands, it's relatively pristine. There is some rainfall effects coming out of Asia, and some contaminants being rained down into what we think is being a totally pristine ecosystem. But for the most part, those animals are cleaner than we would find down here in our part of the world.
Interesting. Okay, well, that's the questions in the chat. So now we'll just open it up. Anybody want to just unmute yourself and ask a question directly, you feel free.
I gotta say, I feel really validated now in that, you know, I have this reputation with my interns of going out and chopping off the heads of sea lions and seals, and people walk up and, you know, oh, it looks like Sarah's already been here. And sometimes it's not me, it's a killer whale. But I'm starting to see, you know, the value of, because now Mendocino animals are being added to that collection at California Academy of Sciences. And just that, how do you measure a skull kind of thing? It just, I think for 6 years now, we've been contributing to that collection with our California sea lions. And I like that people are seeing why we do collect heads and why we're collecting the skulls. And so that's it feels good to be a part of that science and represent for Mendocino County for sure.
Yeah, no, it's all really useful. And, you know, particularly when you got a skull that's labeled, the date that it was found, where it's located, and everything from the size that we can use to compare over time to looking for like stable isotope signatures. The data gets used, you can age the animal as well from the teeth. So the hard parts do contain a lot of information that is useful. And so these collections do have a purpose beyond, I don't know, the collection itself.
For sure. Yeah, we get vibrace, we get that standard length, and the standard length is always belly on the belly and then on the back. So I get both on the belly and on the back, and the, you know, the collection, the exact location and lots of good photos. So
yeah, and there was a fellow in San Francisco that had probably the world's largest collection of
That's
skulls.
who we have on our wall. Yeah, Ray Bandar's collection.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we were given access. I wasn't there, but Sono-san did go. And it was the most unique experience of his life, going into his house and getting to the basement.
Crazy. Yeah, it was amazing. It was amazing. That man was amazing. Yeah. Yeah, that's why we ended up with 50 skulls up here, is because they basically had no room for how large that collection was, or not enough room, basically. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to spend the evening with us, and we will, you have a lot of thank yous in the chat, and we will look forward to hosting you hopefully in person sometime soon.
You know, I would love to come down and maybe talk about some of our research in southern resin killer whales, the gray whale research we're doing as well, and other points of common interest between Fort Bragg and Vancouver.
Yeah, so, yeah, we'll take you to have a beer as well.
Yes. I know exactly the place to go to. Okay. And I appreciate everybody giving up your time this evening too. It was a pleasure to chat with you. If you go onto our website and you want to enter your email address, we send out a newsletter about, I don't know, once a month or once every 3 weeks or so. And also just a little news about some new finding or something that our students are doing. So please feel free to sign up as well.
Yeah, I recommend it. It's a fun read.
Yeah.
Lots of thanks from everybody in the chat pouring in.